Have you ever reached a point where you just wanted to disappear from everything and everyone who had hurt you? Sometimes life beats us down so hard that all we want is a quiet place to heal, away from all the noise and pain. That's exactly how Erik Thorsen felt after 30 years of Viking warfare left him with nothing but scars and regrets. He found an old longhouse in the forest and bought it with his last 5 coins. All he wanted was peace and solitude. But when he opened the door, he found a huge bear already living inside. The bear wouldn't leave, and neither would Erik. What happens when 2 stubborn, wounded souls are forced to survive the winter together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weight of Erik Thorsen's battle-worn axe had become heavier with each passing year. Not because the weapon itself had grown, but because the memories attached to it pressed down on his soul like stones in a burial mound. For 30 winters, this axe had been his closest companion, more faithful than any shield brother, more reliable than any oath sworn over mead. Its iron head bore countless nicks and scratches, each one a story of survival, each dent a moment when death had reached for him and missed. But on that grey morning, when the last battle horn fell silent and Erik stood among the scattered bodies of men he had once called friends, he realized the axe felt different in his hands. It no longer felt like protection. It felt like a burden he could no longer carry. The final battle had been over land that neither side truly needed, fought for a jarl who cared more about his reputation than the lives of the men who bled for it. Erik had watched young warriors, boys, really, charge into spear points with songs of glory on their lips, only to die choking on their own blood in the mud. He had killed 3 men that day, good fighters all, and as he cleaned their blood from his blade, he found himself wondering what wives would weep for them, what children would grow up fatherless because of his skill with iron. That night, while his surviving comrades celebrated their victory with ale and boasting, Erik sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames and seeing only the faces of the dead. Not just from that day, but from all the days stretching back through the years. Hundreds of faces, thousands of moments when his axe had decided who would see another sunrise and who would not. He left before dawn, taking only his weapons, his worn leather pack, and the 5 copper coins that represented his share of the plunder. The coins felt strange in his palm, warm from his body heat, but cold with the knowledge of how they had been earned. Blood money, his grandfather would have called it, though the old man had earned his own share of the same. For weeks, Erik wandered through the villages and settlements scattered across the fjords and forests of his homeland, looking for something he could not name. Peace, perhaps, or forgiveness, or simply a place where the sound of his own footsteps did not echo with the memory of marching to war. In each village, he was recognized for what he was: a warrior without a lord, a sword without a cause. Some offered him work, raiding parties forming for spring campaigns, merchant caravans needing protection for dangerous journeys. Others simply nodded respectfully and moved away, understanding that men like Erik carried storms with them wherever they went. It was in the settlement of Bjornvik, 3 days' walk from the coast, that Erik met the old farmer who would change his life. The man was ancient by any measure, his back bent from decades of working the hard northern soil, his hands gnarled like oak roots. But his eyes were clear and kind, and when he looked at Erik, he seemed to see past the scars and the worn mail to something deeper. "You have the look of a man seeking something," the old farmer said, settling beside Erik at the communal fire where travelers could warm themselves. "I seek nothing but a place to rest," Erik replied, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were not entirely true. The farmer smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered face. "I have something that might interest you, then. A longhouse deep in the forest where the old gods still walk among the trees. Built by my brother, may his soul find peace. He lived there for 15 years after he grew tired of the sword, learned to grow things instead of destroying them." Erik felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he had almost forgotten. Hope. What happened to him? Age took him, as it takes us all eventually. The house has stood empty these past 2 winters. Good timber, solid foundation, close enough to the stream for fresh water, but far enough from any road that the world will leave you be. The farmer studied Erik's face in the firelight. It needs someone who understands what it means to start over. They negotiated quietly, away from curious ears. 5 copper coins for the deed to the property, written on a piece of parchment in the farmer's careful script. It seemed too simple, almost laughably so. After 30 years of complexity, of politics and alliances and blood feuds that stretched back generations, Erik's future came down to 5 coins and a handshake. The journey to the Longhouse took him 2 days through increasingly dense forest. The path was barely visible, marked only by occasional stones placed by the farmer's brother to guide travelers. As Erik walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded until there was nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles and the crunch of frost-hard ground beneath his boots. The forest felt ancient here, untouched by the axes and fires of men. Massive firs towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the weak winter sun. Erik found himself walking more quietly, almost unconsciously, as if he were entering a sacred place where loud voices would be unwelcome. When he finally saw the Longhouse through the trees, Erik stopped and simply stared. It was larger than he had expected, built in the old style, with thick log walls and a steep pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow. Smoke stains around what must be a central fire pit spoke of warm evenings and peaceful meals. A small garden plot, now dormant under a thin layer of frost, showed where someone had grown their own food instead of taking it from others. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Erik smiled. He approached the door slowly, savoring this moment of possibility. Inside, he imagined, would be simple furnishings, perhaps a sleeping platform, shelves for storing food and tools. Everything a man needed to build a quiet life, far from the sound of war horns and the clash of steel on steel. Erik set down his pack and pulled his axe from his belt, not from any sense of danger, but from habit. In his experience, it was always wise to be prepared when entering unknown territory. The door was heavy oak, weathered but solid. Erik placed his hand on the iron handle, took a deep breath of the clean forest air, and pushed it open. What he found inside changed everything. The massive brown bear looked up from where it lay beside the cold fire pit, and for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity. Neither creature moved. Erik's warrior instincts, honed by 3 decades of split-second decisions between life and death, screamed at him to retreat, to slam the door shut and reconsider his life choices. But something deeper, some part of him that had grown weary of always choosing fight over flight, kept his feet planted on the threshold. The bear was enormous, easily twice the size of any man Erik had ever faced in battle. Its dark brown fur was thick with winter growth, and old scars crisscrossed its massive shoulders and flanks like the marks of some ancient conflict. One ear was partially torn, giving it a battle-worn appearance that Erik recognized immediately. This was no ordinary forest creature. This was a survivor. What struck Erik most, however, was not the bear's size or scars, but the collar around its neck. Made of worn brown leather and decorated with carved runic symbols, it spoke of human contact, of some relationship between this beast and the civilized world. The collar was old, the leather cracked and faded, but it had been made with care by someone who knew their craft. The bear's dark eyes studied Erik with an intelligence that seemed almost human. There was no immediate aggression in its posture, no baring of teeth or raising of hackles. Instead, there was something Erik recognized from looking in polished bronze mirrors after particularly brutal campaigns: exhaustion, weariness, the look of a creature that had endured more than its share of hardship and had found a place to rest. Erik slowly shifted his grip on his axe, not raising it in threat, but simply adjusting his hold in case the situation changed quickly. The bear noticed the movement, its massive head tilting slightly to track the weapon, but still made no aggressive moves. "Well," Erik said quietly, his voice sounding strange in the silence of the Longhouse. "This is unexpected. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and Erik could have sworn he saw something like recognition flicker in those dark eyes. Not recognition of him specifically, but of human speech, of the patterns and rhythms that marked one as belonging to the world of men rather than beasts. Erik took a cautious step inside, leaving the door open behind him in case a quick retreat became necessary. The Longhouse was larger inside than it had appeared from outside, with sleeping alcoves built into the walls and shelving that still held clay pots and wooden bowls. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Speaking of months without human habitation, but it was clear the bear had made itself comfortable here. A pile of pine boughs in one corner had been arranged into a makeshift bed, and Erik could see scratch marks on the wooden walls where powerful claws had scraped away bark and wood. The central fire pit was cold, but showed signs of recent use, not by human hands, but by a creature clever enough to keep embers alive during the harsh northern nights. "You've been here a while," Erik observed, speaking as much to calm his own nerves as to communicate with the animal. "Made yourself quite comfortable." The bear watched him move further into the room, its posture relaxed but alert. Erik noticed that despite its size and obvious strength, the creature was being careful not to knock over any of the human belongings scattered around the room. Bowls and pottery remained undisturbed on their shelves, and the simple wooden furniture showed no signs of damage beyond normal wear. This was not the behavior Erik expected from a wild animal. Bears, in his experience, were creatures of appetite and instinct, likely to tear apart anything that stood between them and food or shelter. But this one seemed to understand the difference between necessary comfort and unnecessary destruction. Erik set his pack down slowly, every movement deliberate and calm. The bear's eyes tracked each gesture, but it made no move to challenge his presence. If anything, it seemed curious about this strange human who had entered its domain without immediately trying to drive it away. "I paid good coin for this place," Erik continued, finding that talking helped settle the surreal nature of the situation. 5 copper pieces. Everything I had left from 30 years of following war banners. He gestured around the room with his free hand. Of course, nobody mentioned it came with a resident. The bear's massive head tilted again, and Erik was struck by how expressive its face could be. There was intelligence there, certainly, but also something that looked almost like loneliness. The realization hit him with unexpected force. This creature was alone here, just as Erik had planned to be alone. 2 solitary beings who had each found the same refuge from a world that had grown too difficult to bear. Erik studied the runic symbols on the collar more carefully. The carving was skilled work, each symbol cut deep into the leather and darkened with age. He could make out several of the marks, symbols for protection, for peace, for the bond between human and animal. This was not a restraint or a mark of captivity, but something closer to a gift, a sign of respect between species. "Someone cared about you," Erik murmured, and the bear's ears pricked forward at his gentle tone. Made that collar with their own hands, spent time getting the symbols just right. Whoever they were, they wanted you to be safe. The implications of the collar settled over Erik like morning mist. The farmer had mentioned his brother living here for 15 years, learning to grow things instead of destroying them. Had the old man formed some kind of bond with this creature? Had they shared this space in peace? The bear rose slowly to its feet, and Erik tensed despite himself. Standing, the creature was even more imposing, its massive frame filling the center of the room. But instead of moving toward Erik, it padded over to what had once been the sleeping area and settled down again, this time facing the doorway, and Erik more directly. The message was clear enough. The bear was not leaving, but neither was it preventing Erik from staying. It had simply repositioned itself to keep watch over both the entrance and this strange new human who had entered its world. Erik found himself fighting down an unexpected smile. In all his years of warfare and wandering, he had never encountered a negotiation quite like this one. No words exchanged, no terms discussed, just 2 battle-scarred creatures sizing each other up and coming to some unspoken understanding about sharing space. "Well," Erik said finally, lowering his axe but not putting it away entirely, "I suppose we'll need to work something out. I'm not going anywhere, and from the look of things, neither are you." The bear's response was to settle more comfortably onto its makeshift bed. Massive paws crossed in front of it like a dog settling in for a long nap. But its eyes remained alert, watching Erik with the patience of a creature that had learned to wait and observe before acting. As the light outside began to fade toward evening, Erik realized his simple plan for a peaceful retirement had become something far more complicated. He had come here seeking solitude, but instead had found something he had never expected, a companion who, like himself, bore the scars of survival and sought nothing more than a place to rest. The question now was whether two such different creatures could learn to share the same sanctuary, or whether the winter nights ahead would test them both beyond their limits. The first night was a careful dance of territorial respect and mutual wariness. Erik had positioned himself near the door, close enough to escape if necessary, but far enough from the bear's chosen corner to avoid seeming aggressive. His axe lay within easy reach, though he had deliberately placed it beside rather than in his hand, a gesture of cautious trust that seemed to register with his unlikely roommate. Sleep came in fragments, broken by every shift and sigh from the massive creature across the room. But as the hours passed and no violence erupted, Erik found himself relaxing, despite the strangeness of the situation. The bear's breathing was steady and deep, occasionally punctuated by soft, rumbling sounds that were almost comforting in their regularity. When morning light filtered through the gaps in the wooden shutters, Erik woke to find the bear already up and sitting by the door, looking out through a crack as if keeping watch. The creature acknowledged Erik's stirring with a brief glance, but made no move to prevent him from rising. Erik stretched carefully, his joints protesting after a night on the hard floor. He had slept in worse places during his years of campaigning, but his body was no longer young enough to ignore such discomfort. As he moved about gathering his belongings, the bear tracked his movements with alert but non-threatening attention. "Morning to you too," Erik said quietly. Earning another brief glance from his companion, the Longhouse revealed more of its secrets in the daylight. Erik began a systematic exploration of the space, careful to move slowly and avoid any actions that might be interpreted as aggressive. The bear watched his investigation with what seemed like curiosity, occasionally shifting position to get a better view of what Erik was examining. On a shelf near the sleeping alcove, Erik discovered a collection of wooden bowls, carved with intricate patterns. One in particular caught his attention, smaller than the others, perfectly proportioned for human hands, decorated with symbols that spoke of home and hearth rather than war and conquest. It was beautiful in its simplicity, each curve smoothed by countless meals and years of use. As Erik lifted the bowl to examine it more closely, he found himself thinking of the farmer's brother who had lived here for 15 years. This bowl had been carved by hands that had once gripped sword hilts, shaped by someone who had learned to create rather than destroy. The workmanship was skilled but unpretentious, the work of a man who carved for pleasure rather than profit. "Someone took time with this," Erik murmured, running his fingers along the smooth wood. "You knew what they were doing." The bear made a soft huffing sound that might have been agreement or might simply have been breathing. But when Erik looked over, he noticed the creature's attention was focused on the bowl in his hands. And there was something in those dark eyes that looked almost like recognition. Erik set the bowl down carefully and continued his exploration. In another alcove, he found clay pots filled with dried herbs, their scent still strong despite the months of abandonment. Someone had been careful about preparing for winter, gathering and preserving the medicines and seasonings that could mean the difference between comfort and mere survival in the harsh northern climate. A wooden chest near the sleeping area held warm furs and woven blankets, along with tools for maintaining the Longhouse and working the small garden plot outside. Everything spoke of a life lived simply but thoughtfully, with attention paid to the small details that made a dwelling into a home. But it was the discovery of a second set of bowls, much larger than human-sized portions would require, that made Erik pause and reconsider what he thought he knew about this place. The large bowls were worn smooth, their edges bearing the marks of regular use. One still held traces of what might have been grain or dried meat, and there were scratch marks around the rim that could only have been made by claws. Powerful claws belonging to a creature that had been fed here regularly and had learned to eat carefully from human-made vessels. Erik looked across at the bear, who was now watching his discovery with unmistakable interest. The creature's posture had shifted, becoming more alert but not aggressive. If anything, the bear seemed hopeful, as if the sight of those familiar bowls carried meaning that went beyond mere objects. "You lived here before," Erik said, not really asking a question.
"With the old man."
"He fed you, cared for you." The bear's ears pricked forward at his words. "That's why the collar. You weren't his prisoner, you were his friend." Understanding settled over Erik like sunrise, breaking through morning clouds. The farmer's brother had not simply retreated to the forest to live alone. He had found companionship with this remarkable creature, building a relationship that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild animal. For 15 years, man and bear had shared this space, each providing something the other needed. The implications were staggering. Everything Erik thought he knew about bears, about wild creatures, about the impossibility of such partnerships, was challenged by the evidence before him. The careful way the bear moved around human belongings, its apparent understanding of shared space, the intelligence in its eyes when it looked at familiar objects, all of it spoke to a relationship that had been built over time through patience and mutual respect. Erik picked up one of the large bowls, noting its weight and craftsmanship. Like the smaller bowl, it had been carved with care, sized perfectly for its intended user. The old man had not simply tolerated the bear's presence, he had actively accommodated it, creating a living arrangement that served both their needs. "He's been gone 2 winters, Erik said, speaking his thoughts aloud, as he often did when trying to work through complex problems. "You've been alone here all this time, waiting for someone to come back." The bear's response was subtle, but unmistakable. Its massive head lowered slightly, and the set of its shoulders suggested something that looked remarkably like grief. This creature had not simply claimed an abandoned dwelling, it had refused to leave the home it had shared with a beloved companion. Maintaining a vigil that had lasted through 2 harsh winters, Erik felt something shift in his chest. A tightening that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. He too was here because he had nowhere else to go, because he was tired of being alone, with nothing but memories and regrets for company. The bear's loyalty to a departed friend, its stubborn refusal to abandon a place that held meaning, was something Erik understood in his bones. "Well," Erik said quietly, settling the bowl back in its place with deliberate care, "I suppose that makes us both refugees." The bear made another soft sound, almost conversational in tone. For the first time since entering the Longhouse, Erik felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. This was not a standoff between man and beast. It was 2 grieving souls who had found themselves sharing the same sanctuary, each carrying losses that the other might actually understand. Erik looked around the Longhouse with new eyes, seeing not just a shelter he had purchased, but a home that had been built through patience and shared experience. If he was going to stay here, if he was going to honor the memory of the man who had created this place, he would need to learn not just to coexist with the bear, but to understand what their relationship could become. The afternoon passed quietly, with Erik organizing his few belongings while the bear dozed in its chosen corner. But as evening approached, Erik found himself faced with his first practical challenge as the Longhouse's new occupant: how to build a fire that would warm them both without startling his companion into aggressive action. The temperature dropped with the sun, and Erik could feel the Longhouse growing cold around them. The bear seemed unbothered by the chill, its thick fur adequate protection against the northern winter. But Erik would need warmth to survive the night. He approached the central fire pit cautiously, aware that his movements were being closely observed. The bear had shifted position to watch him more directly, its dark eyes tracking every step. Erik moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible and his actions predictable. The fire pit showed signs of recent use, though not by human hands. Charred wood and cold ashes suggested the bear had somehow managed to keep fires burning during its time alone. Erik found this both impressive and puzzling. Few wild animals had the intelligence or patience to maintain fire, yet the evidence was clear. As Erik began gathering kindling from a neat stack left by the Longhouse's previous owner, the bear rose and padded over to investigate. Erik froze, his heart rate quickening, but the creature simply sniffed at the dry wood and then looked at Erik expectantly. "You know what this is for," Erik observed quietly. "You've seen this done before." The bear settled down nearby, close enough to benefit from the warmth once it was established, but not so close as to interfere with Erik's work. There was something almost ceremonial in the way it positioned itself, as if this evening ritual held significance beyond mere warmth. Erik struck flint to steel, coaxing sparks into the carefully arranged tinder. The bear watched intently, its attention focused on every detail of the process. When the first small flames caught and began to spread, the creature made a soft sound that might have been satisfaction. As the fire grew stronger, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, Erik found himself relaxing in a way he had not expected. The warmth on his face, the steady breathing of his companion, the simple pleasure of watching flames consume wood. It all felt remarkably peaceful after so many years of sleeping in war camps, where fires meant targets for enemy arrows. "This is better," Erik said, settling back against a wooden chest that made a decent backrest. "Much better." The bear had positioned itself where the heat could reach its thick fur, and Erik noticed that despite its size and wild nature, it was careful not to get too close to the flames. Someone had taught it to respect fire while still benefiting from its warmth. As the evening deepened, Erik's attention was drawn to something he had not noticed during his earlier exploration. On the wall above the bear's chosen sleeping area, barely visible in the flickering firelight, was a tapestry that had been woven with remarkable skill. The fabric showed signs of age, but remained intact, its colors still vibrant, despite years of exposure to smoke and weather. The scene it depicted made Erik's breath catch in his throat. It showed a man and a bear sharing a meal beside a fire, their forms rendered with an attention to detail that spoke of deep familiarity with the subjects. The human figure was elderly but strong, his beard white with age, but his posture upright and confident. The bear was unmistakably the same creature that now shared Erik's fire, down to the distinctive scarring on its shoulders and the intelligent expression in its eyes. Both figures were portrayed not as master and pet, but as equals, companions who had chosen to share their lives. "He made this," Erik said, studying the tapestry's intricate weaving. "The old man. He wanted to remember what you meant to him." The bear's attention followed Erik's gaze to the tapestry, and its reaction was immediate and profound. The massive creature rose and approached the wall, standing on its hind legs to bring its nose close to the woven scene. It sniffed gently at the fabric, then made a low, mournful sound that spoke of loss and longing. Erik felt his throat tighten as he watched this display of grief. The bear understood what the tapestry represented, not just an artistic creation, but a memorial to a relationship that had defined both their lives. The creature's gentle interaction with the weaving showed a depth of emotion that challenged everything Erik thought he knew about wild animals. When the bear settled back down, its position had changed subtly. Instead of facing the fire or the door, it now lay where it could see both the tapestry and Erik, as if trying to bridge the gap between memory and present reality. Erik found himself talking, the words coming easier in the warm darkness. "I lost people too, not the same way you did, but lost them all the same. Some to war, some to time. some because I was too proud or too stupid to hold on to what mattered. The bear's ears moved to catch every word, and Erik had the strange sensation that he was being truly heard, perhaps for the first time in years. In the war camps, conversation was either boasting or complaints. In the villages, people spoke to him with the careful distance reserved for dangerous men. But here, in the firelight, he found himself speaking with the honesty that surprised him. I had a brother once, younger than me, always following me around when we were boys. Wanted to be a warrior like his big brother. Erik stared into the flames, seeing faces in the dancing light. I told him war was glorious, that dying in battle was the greatest honor a man could achieve. Stupid words from a stupid boy who thought he knew everything. The bear made a soft, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, but something deeper, more questioning. Erik took it as encouragement to continue. He died in his first battle, 17 years old, and full of the songs I'd taught him about heroic deaths and eternal glory. Took a spear in the chest and bled out in the mud while I held him. Erik's voice grew quieter. He asked me if the gods would welcome him to their hall, if his death meant something. I told him yes, of course. What else could I say? But I knew it was a lie. There was no glory in watching a boy die for another man's ambition. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up toward the smoke hole in the roof. The bear had moved closer during Erik's confession, not quite within touching distance, but near enough that its presence felt like companionship rather than observation. After that, fighting felt different. Every enemy I faced, I saw my brother's face. Every victory just reminded me that someone else was losing a son, a father, a friend. But I kept fighting because it was all I knew how to do, and because stopping meant admitting that all those years, all those deaths, had been for nothing. The bear's response was to settle more comfortably, its massive form relaxing in a way that suggested complete trust. The gesture was not lost on Erik, who realized that his confession had somehow deepened their connection. This creature, who had also lost someone important, recognized the pain in his words. As the night deepened and the fire burned lower, Erik found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Tomorrow, he would begin learning how to share this space properly, how to honor the relationship the bear had lost while building something new for both of them. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Erik fell asleep without his hand on his weapon, lulled by the steady breathing of a companion who understood loss as deeply as he did. Erik woke to the sound of wind howling through the forest and snow pelting against the shuttered windows. The blizzard had arrived in the night, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep cold that could kill a man in minutes if he were caught unprepared. Inside the Longhouse, however, all was warm and peaceful. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the thick log walls held the heat well. More surprising to Erik was the discovery that someone, or something, had added wood to the fire during the night. Fresh logs burned steadily in the pit, their flames casting the same dancing shadows he had fallen asleep watching. The bear was absent from its usual corner, and Erik felt a moment of concern before he heard movement from the direction of the door. His companion was there, pressed against the wooden barrier, listening to the storm with the alertness of a creature that understood the dangers winter could bring. Erik rose quietly, his joints protesting the cold despite the fire's warmth. As he approached, the bear glanced at him briefly before returning its attention to the sounds outside. Through gaps in the doorframe, Erik could see whirling snow and darkness that spoke of a storm that would last for hours, perhaps days. "Good thing we're both inside," Erik said softly, settling beside his companion near the door. The bear's presence was surprisingly comforting, its massive bulk a reassuring reminder that he was not facing this storm alone. As the morning progressed and the blizzard showed no signs of weakening, Erik found himself exploring more of the Longhouse's contents. In a wooden chest he had not fully investigated before, he discovered something that made his heart race: his father's ring, somehow mixed in with his own belongings, though he had been certain it was lost. The ring was silver, worn smooth by generations of wear, engraved with symbols that connected Erik to a family line stretching back beyond memory. His father had given it to him on his 18th birthday, the day before Erik's first battle, with words about honor and responsibility that had seemed like empty ceremony at the time. Erik had thought the ring lost during a river crossing 3 years ago, swept away when his pack had torn and scattered his possessions into the current. Finding it now felt like a message from the dead. A reminder of the man he had been before war hardened him into something his father might not have recognized. As Erik turned the ring over in his hands, examining the familiar engravings, the bear approached with quiet steps. The creature seemed to sense the significance of the moment, settling nearby with the patient attention it had shown when Erik spoke of his brother. "This belonged to my father," Erik said, holding up the ring so the firelight caught the silver. "And his father before him, back through more generations than I can count. It was supposed to remind me of who I was, where I came from." The bear's dark eyes fixed on the ring with apparent interest, though Erik suspected it was responding more to his emotional state than to the object itself. The creature had shown remarkable sensitivity to human feelings, as if years of companionship with the Longhouse's previous owner had taught it to read the subtle signs of mood and meaning. "I wore it through every battle, every campaign. Thought it would protect me, keep me connected to something good while I was doing terrible things." Erik slipped the ring onto his finger, where it settled with the comfortable weight of long familiarity. "But I stopped feeling worthy of it somewhere along the way. Started thinking it was better off lost than worn by someone who had forgotten what honor really meant." The bear made a soft rumbling sound, almost conversational. Erik had begun to recognize these vocalizations as responses to his words, as if the creature was offering its own commentary on his confessions. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Longhouse, but inside, the atmosphere grew more contemplative. Erik found himself thinking about his father for the first time in years, without the bitter edge of disappointment that had colored such memories. The old man had been a warrior too, but of a different sort, one who fought to protect rather than conquer, who saw strength as something to be used in service of others rather than personal glory. "He would have liked you," Erik said, watching as the bear settled more comfortably near the fire. "My father, I mean. He always said the measure of a man could be seen in how he treated creatures that couldn't fight back. You're not defenseless, obviously, but there's something about the way you carry yourself that he would have respected." The bear's response was to move closer, not quite within touching distance, but near enough that Erik could feel the warmth radiating from its thick fur. The gesture felt like acceptance, perhaps even affection, and Erik found himself relaxing in ways he had not expected. As the day wore on, trapped inside by the storm, Erik began to establish routines that took the bear's presence into account. When he prepared his midday meal, dried meat and hardtack from his traveling supplies, he set out one of the large wooden bowls he had discovered earlier. The bear watched this preparation with obvious interest, and when Erik placed a portion of meat in the bowl, the creature approached carefully and began to eat. The shared meal felt significant in ways Erik could not fully articulate. It was more than simple feeding, it was an acknowledgement of partnership, a recognition that they were no longer simply two creatures sharing space, but companions choosing to care for each other's welfare. After eating, the bear demonstrated another unexpected behavior. It approached the area where Erik had arranged his sleeping furs and began carefully arranging pine boughs and dried grass into a more comfortable configuration. The work was done with obvious intelligence and purpose, creating a sleeping area that would be warmer and more comfortable than what Erik had managed on his own. "You're taking care of me," Erik realized aloud, watching as the bear continued its work. "Just like you took care of him." The bear paused in its arrangements and looked at Erik directly, its expression holding what seemed like confirmation. This was indeed what it had done for the Longhouse's previous occupant, provided comfort, warmth, and companionship during the long winter months when human contact was impossible. Erik felt something he had not experienced in years, the sense of being cared for by another living being. In the war camps, men looked after each other only as far as military necessity required. In the villages, hospitality was offered, but always with the careful distance maintained around dangerous strangers. But here, this remarkable creature was extending genuine care, without expectation of reward or fear of consequence. The storm raged through the afternoon and into the evening. But inside the Longhouse, time passed peacefully. Erik found himself talking more freely than he had since childhood, sharing memories and thoughts with his attentive companion. The bear seemed to understand that these conversations were important, positioning itself where it could see Erik's face and responding with soft sounds that encouraged him to continue. As night fell and the fire burned lower, Erik realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The ring on his finger no longer felt like a burden of unmet expectations. It felt like a reminder of who he could choose to become. When he finally settled into the improved sleeping area the bear had prepared, Erik found himself speaking one more truth into the warm darkness. "I think I understand now why the old man stayed here so long. It wasn't just about getting away from the world. It was about finding something worth protecting instead of something worth destroying." The bear's response was to settle nearby, close enough that Erik could hear its steady breathing, but far enough away to respect his need for space. As sleep claimed him, Erik realized that for the first time in decades he was looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring it. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. When Erik pushed open the Longhouse door, he was greeted by drifts that reached nearly to his waist, and a silence so complete it seemed to ring in his ears. The forest had become a cathedral of white pillars and crystal arches, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The bear emerged behind him, its massive paws spreading wide to distribute its weight across the snow's surface. Where Erik would have struggled and sunk, his companion moved with the practiced ease of a creature born to this environment. The contrast was not lost on Erik. Here in this place, he was the one who needed protection and guidance. As they made their way around the Longhouse, checking for damage and clearing pathways, Erik's attention was drawn to markings on one of the main support beams that he had not noticed before. Carved deep into the weathered wood were runic symbols, arranged in neat lines that spoke of careful planning and execution. Erik brushed away accumulated dirt and soot from the carvings, revealing their full message. The runes spoke of harmony between man and beast, of wisdom found in the quiet places far from civilization's noise. Most intriguingly, they told of strength that came not from conquest, but from understanding, from learning to see the world through eyes other than one's own. "He left us instructions," Erik murmured, running his fingers along the carved symbols. Lessons learned over 15 years of sharing this place. The bear had approached to investigate Erik's discovery, its nose twitching as it examined the familiar markings. The creature's reaction suggested recognition. These runes had been carved during its time with the previous owner, perhaps witnessed in their creation. One passage in particular struck Erik with its relevance to his current situation. Translated roughly, it read, "The warrior who learns to tend instead of tear becomes stronger than any sword arm. In caring for another, we discover who we were meant to be." The words felt like a direct message from the dead, advice passed down from one lost soul to another. Erik found himself thinking of all the years he had spent perfecting the arts of destruction, becoming more skilled at ending lives than preserving them. Here was a different kind of strength being offered, the power that came from nurturing rather than conquering. Over the following days, as the snow settled and the routines of winter life established themselves, Erik began to understand what the runes meant in practical terms. Each morning, he and the bear would venture out together to gather firewood and check the small snares the previous owner had left scattered through the forest. The bear's knowledge of the local terrain was invaluable, leading Erik to resources he would never have found on his own. In the evenings, by firelight, Erik began experimenting with skills he had never thought to develop. Using tools left behind by the Longhouse's previous occupant, he started carving, first simple repairs to damaged bowls and utensils, then more ambitious projects that challenged his patience and creativity. The bear watched these efforts with apparent fascination, sometimes approaching to sniff at the wood shavings or investigate a partially completed piece. Erik found himself explaining his work aloud, describing the grain of the wood and his plans for each carving. The bear's presence made these monologues feel less like talking to himself and more like sharing knowledge with an interested student. The secret is working with the wood instead of fighting it, Erik said one evening, carefully shaping what would become a new ladle. Every piece has its own character, its own way it wants to be shaped. Force it wrong and it breaks. Listen to what it's telling you, and it becomes something beautiful. As he spoke, Erik realized he was describing more than woodworking. The same patience and attention that created useful objects could be applied to relationships, to healing, to the slow work of rebuilding a life that had been broken by years of violence. The bear seemed to understand the deeper meaning of these lessons. On several occasions, Erik caught it watching him work with an expression that looked remarkably like approval. More than once, the creature would approach while Erik was carving and settle nearby, its presence somehow making the work feel more meaningful. The nightmares that had plagued Erik for years began to change during this period. Instead of endless battles and the faces of the dead, his dreams filled with images of the Longhouse in different seasons, snow melting to reveal new growth, summer sun streaming through the windows, autumn harvest being gathered and preserved. In these dreams, he was not alone, but accompanied by a familiar, massive shape that moved through the seasons with him. One particularly clear morning, as Erik worked on carving a new bowl to replace one that had finally split beyond repair, the bear approached carrying something in its mouth. With careful gentleness, it deposited a perfect piece of birch bark at Erik's feet, then settled back to watch his reaction. Erik examined the bark, noting its smooth texture and lack of blemishes. It was exactly what he would have chosen for the decorative inlay he had been planning for the bowl's rim. The bear had somehow understood not just that Erik was working on a project, but specifically what materials would improve it. "How did you know?" Erik asked, looking into those intelligent dark eyes. "Have you been watching me work so closely that you understand what I need before I do?" The bear's response was a soft huff that sounded almost like laughter, followed by a gentle nudge toward the bark with its massive nose. The message was clear: less talking, more working. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, Erik found his understanding of strength and purpose shifting in ways he had not expected. The muscles he had built for swinging weapons were being retrained for different tasks: splitting wood, hauling water, creating rather than destroying. His hands, so long accustomed to the grip of sword and axe, were learning the subtler touches required for carving and crafting. But the most profound change was in his relationship with the bear itself. What had begun as wary coexistence had evolved into something that felt like family. They had developed their own language of sounds and gestures, their own rituals of shared meals and evening conversations by the fire. The bear's presence had become as natural and necessary as the warmth of the hearth. On the longest night of winter, as they sat together beside the fire while wind howled through the forest outside, Erik felt a peace he had never known was possible. The ring on his finger caught the firelight, its engravings seeming to glow with approval. He was finally becoming the kind of man his father had hoped to raise, strong enough to protect what mattered, wise enough to know the difference between courage and cruelty. The bear seemed to sense the significance of the moment. It moved closer than usual, settling where Erik could feel the warmth of its fur against his shoulder. In that contact, Erik felt acceptance, companionship, and something that might have been love. Spring's first tentative warmth brought with it the urge to explore areas of the Longhouse that winter's confines had made less urgent. As Erik cleared away accumulated debris from the corners and alcoves, he discovered something that would change everything. He thought he understood about his situation. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the back wall was a small wooden chest, carefully wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from moisture. Inside, Erik found treasures that spoke of a life far richer and more complex than he had imagined. Letters, carved toys, and a small wooden bear that had been crafted with extraordinary skill and obvious love. The wooden toy bear was perfect in every detail, from its carved fur texture to its intelligent expression. But what made Erik's breath catch was its size. It was clearly meant for small hands, a child's treasure carved by someone who understood both the animal it represented and the young person who would cherish it. As Erik lifted the toy bear from the chest, his living companion approached with unusual urgency. The massive creature sniffed at the carved wood with an intensity that bordered on desperation, then made a sound Erik had never heard before, a low, keening wail that spoke of profound loss and longing. The bear's reaction confirmed what Erik was beginning to suspect. This was not just any toy, but a specific representation of a specific bear, crafted by someone who knew the creature intimately. The previous owner of the Longhouse had not been a solitary hermit, he had been a father, sharing this space with children who had played with toys and learned to see the massive bear not as a threat, but as part of their family. Erik's hands trembled as he examined the other contents of the chest. There were letters written in a child's careful script, stories about adventures in the forest and lessons learned from Bear Friend, as the creature was affectionately called. The letters spoke of a little girl named Astrid, who was not afraid of the massive animal, but who would curl up against its warm fur on cold nights and share her meals with patient generosity. One letter, dated just over 2 years ago, stopped Erik's heart. "Dear Papa, Mama says we cannot come to the forest house anymore because the sickness has taken too many in the village. She says Bear Friend will take care of you until we can return. Tell him I miss him and that I have been practicing the songs he likes. When the sickness passes, we will all be together again. Your loving daughter, Astrid." Erik sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was reading. The old farmer's brother had not died of age. He had died of the plague that had swept through the region 2 years past, taking entire families and leaving the survivors too frightened to venture into areas where the sick had lived. The bear had not been alone in the Longhouse by choice. It had been waiting for a family that would never return. The bear's behavior over the past months suddenly made perfect sense. Its careful movement around human belongings, its understanding of shared meals and comfortable sleep arrangements, its patience with Erik's adjustment to domestic life, all of it had been learned through years of living as part of a human family unit. But more than that, the bear's grief became understandable. It was not just mourning the loss of one companion, but an entire way of life. The laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, the sense of belonging to something larger than survival, all of it had been stripped away by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Erik looked up at his companion, seeing the massive creature with entirely new eyes. This was not a wild animal that had learned to tolerate humans. This was a family member who had lost everything and everyone it had ever loved, maintaining a vigil in their shared home while hoping against hope that they would somehow return. The bear approached the chest and gently nuzzled the carved toy, its actions so tender that Erik felt tears sting his eyes. Here was a creature capable of love so deep and loyalty so complete that it would wait alone through 2 harsh winters rather than abandon the place where happiness had once lived. "Oh, my friend," Erik whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you weren't just waiting for someone to come home. You were keeping the home ready for them." The bear's response was to settle beside Erik, its massive head resting near the open chest as if drawing comfort from these remnants of the family it had lost. For long minutes they sat together in silence, 2 beings united by their understanding of love, loss, and the terrible weight of waiting for reunions that would never come. Erik carefully lifted another item from the chest, a child's drawing of the Longhouse with stick figures representing the family. In the picture, a large brown shape stood protectively behind the smaller human figures, and above it all, someone had written "Our Family" in careful letters. The drawing showed Erik what he had become part of without understanding it. By choosing to share this space with the bear, by learning to communicate and care for each other, he had not just formed an unusual partnership. He had become part of something that had been broken but could perhaps be repaired in a different form. More items emerged from the chest: a small carved flute, children's clothes sized for different ages, pressed flowers that had once been gifts from small hands to a beloved bear friend. Each item painted a picture of a life filled with simple joys and deep connections. A family that had found happiness in the quiet places away from civilization's demands. The bear's collar, Erik now understood, had not been placed by the old man alone, but had been a family project. The runes carved into its leather surface had been chosen by people who saw the creature not as a pet or servant, but as an equal member of their household, deserving of respect and protection. As afternoon light streamed through the Longhouse windows, Erik made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could not bring back the family the bear had lost, could not undo the tragedy that had separated them forever. But he could choose to honor their memory by building something new on the foundation they had created. "We can't be what was lost," Erik said quietly, his words directed as much to himself as to his companion. "But we can be what comes next. We can keep their love alive by learning to love each other." The bear's response was to move closer until Erik could feel the steady rhythm of its breathing and the warmth of its massive form. In that moment, surrounded by the remnants of a family's happiness and looking ahead to whatever they might build together, Erik understood that he had found something more precious than the simple peace he had originally sought. He had found a reason to become the man his father had always hoped he could be, not just a warrior or a survivor, but someone capable of creating and protecting the kind of love that could survive even the deepest losses. The discovery of the family's story marked a turning point that Erik felt in his bones. Over the following weeks, he found himself approaching their shared life with new intentionality, understanding that he was not just surviving in the Longhouse, but actively choosing to honor the legacy of love that had been built within its walls. Erik began keeping a leather journal, recording not just the practical details of their daily routines, but his observations about the bear's remarkable intelligence and the deepening bond between them. Each evening by firelight, he would write carefully measured thoughts about what he was learning, creating a record that someone else might one day discover and understand. "Today, Bear Friend showed me where the best berries grow come summer," Erik wrote one evening, using the name Astrid had given to their companion. "He moves through the forest like he owns it, but not with dominance, with the confidence of someone who belongs completely to a place and has that place belong to him in return. There is wisdom in this that all my years of taking territory by force never taught me." The bear, whom Erik had begun addressing directly as Bear Friend in honor of the child's memory, seemed to sense the significance of these writing sessions. It would position itself where it could observe Erik's work, occasionally making soft sounds that Erik interpreted as encouragement or commentary. As spring progressed towards summer, their routines became more elaborate and purposeful. Erik repaired and expanded the garden plot, learning to coax life from the soil instead of taking it from others. Her friend proved surprisingly helpful in this work, using its powerful claws to break up hard ground and its keen nose to locate the best spots for different plants. The collaboration felt natural, as if they were rediscovering skills that had always existed between their kinds. Erik found himself wondering how much human civilization had lost when it decided that such partnerships were impossible. How many opportunities for mutual understanding had been abandoned in favor of conquest and domination. But their peaceful progress was not destined to continue undisturbed. The first sign of trouble came on a warm afternoon when Bear Friend's behavior suddenly changed. The creature's relaxed demeanor vanished, replaced by an alertness that spoke of potential danger. Its massive head lifted, nostrils flaring as it tested the air, ears swiveling to catch sounds Erik's human senses could not detect. Erik had learned to trust his companion's instincts completely. When Bearfriend moved to position itself between Erik and the forest approach, every muscle tense with protective readiness, Erik quietly reached for his axe, not with the eager anticipation of his warrior days, but with the reluctant acceptance of someone who hoped he would not need to use it. The sounds, when they finally reached Erik's ears, sent cold dread through his veins. Human voices, multiple men moving through the forest without any attempt at stealth. The careless noise of their passage and the tone of their conversation suggested desperation rather than confidence. These were not hunters or travelers, but people running from something, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Erik's mind raced through possibilities. Raiders fleeing a failed attack, deserters from some local conflict, or simply desperate men driven by hunger or fear to seek shelter in the deep woods. None of the options suggested peaceful intentions, especially if they discovered a lone man sharing space with what they would surely see as a dangerous wild animal. "Easy, friend," Erik murmured to Bearfriend, who was now standing fully alert with hackles raised. "Let's see what they want before we decide what to do about them." Through the trees, Erik could make out shapes moving toward the Longhouse. 3 men, armed with weapons, but moving with the exhausted shamble of people who had been traveling hard for days. Their clothes were torn and stained, and even from a distance, Erik could see that at least one of them was injured. The lead man stopped when he spotted the Longhouse, gesturing to his companions with obvious relief. They had found shelter, or thought they had. What they did not know was that the shelter was already occupied by residents who had very different ideas about how civilized beings should treat each other. Erik made a quick decision. Rather than wait for the strangers to approach the door, he would meet them outside, where he could control the encounter and where Bearfriend would have room to maneuver if things went badly. He stepped out of the Longhouse with his axe visible but not raised, presenting himself as someone prepared for trouble, but not necessarily seeking it. The effect on the 3 strangers was immediate. They stopped short, hands moving to their weapons, clearly not having expected to find the Longhouse occupied. Erik could see now that they were young warriors, probably survivors of some recent battle, carrying the hard look of men who had seen too much violence too quickly. "Peace!" Erik called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "You're welcome to warm yourselves by our fire, but understand that this place has rules." The lead stranger, a boy really despite his warrior's gear, stepped forward with the bravado of youth trying to mask uncertainty. "Your fire? This place has been empty for years. We claim it by right of need." Erik almost smiled at the familiar swagger. He had sounded exactly the same at that age, convinced that strength and boldness could solve any problem. The difference was that Erik now understood what such attitudes cost, both for those who carried them and for those who suffered under them. "Empty of some things," Erik agreed calmly, "but not empty of life and not without those who protect it." As if summoned by his words, Bearfriend emerged from the Longhouse and positioned itself beside Erik. The effect on the 3 strangers was dramatic. Hands flew to weapons, curses filled the air, and the injured man actually stumbled backward in terror. But Erik noticed something else in their reactions beyond fear. There was recognition there, an understanding that they faced not just a dangerous animal, but a creature that clearly stood with the human beside it. The implications of such a partnership were not lost on warriors trained to read the dynamics of potential conflict. "What are you?" the lead stranger asked, his voice tight with nervous energy. Erik considered the question seriously. What was he? Not the warrior he had been, certainly. Not quite the hermit he had planned to become. Something new, perhaps. Something that bridged the gap between the civilized world and the deeper wisdom of the wild places. Someone who has learned that strength serves best when it protects rather than conquers, Erik replied. You're hurt, you're hungry, and you're far from home. We can help with all of those things, but only if you're willing to accept help on terms that honor this place and what it represents. The standoff stretched taut between them, balanced on the edge of decisions that could lead toward violence or toward something entirely different. Erik found himself hoping these young men would choose wisely, not just for their own sakes, but because what happened in the next few minutes would test everything he had learned about becoming someone worthy of the peace he had found. The injured stranger chose for all of them by collapsing. His legs simply gave out, sending him crashing to the forest floor in a tangle of limbs and torn clothing. Erik could see now that what he had taken for minor wounds were actually serious. Injuries, a deep gash along the man's sword arm that had been bleeding slowly for hours, and signs of fever that spoke of infection setting in. The other two warriors immediately moved to help their fallen companion, their weapons forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns. Erik found himself looking at a mirror of countless scenes from his own warrior days, young men far from home, loyalty to their comrades, the only thing standing between them and complete despair. He needs help, the lead warrior said, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear for his friend. We've been running for 3 days. There was a battle. Our Jarl fell. Everything went to pieces. We barely got out alive. Erik recognized the hollow tone, the way trauma could strip away pretense and leave only the essential truths. These were not raiders or bandits, but survivors of the same kind of meaningless conflict that had finally broken Erik's own faith in the warrior's path. Bear Friend seemed to sense the change in the situation as well. The massive creature's posture relaxed slightly, though it remained alert and protective. Erik had learned to read his companion's moods, and the bear's current stance suggested cautious willingness to help rather than immediate threat assessment. Bring him inside, Erik said, making a decision that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Carefully. Bear Friend won't hurt you if you move slowly and keep your weapons sheathed, but sudden movements make everyone nervous. The two healthy warriors exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about entering a confined space with what they undoubtedly saw as a wild animal. But their friend's worsening condition left them little choice. They lifted him gently, supporting his weight between them, and followed Erik toward the Longhouse door. Bear Friend moved aside to allow them passage, but Erik noticed how his companion positioned itself to observe every movement. The bear's intelligence was on full display. It understood that these strangers were being allowed entry, but was ready to respond instantly if their behavior proved threatening. Inside the Longhouse, the strangers' amazement was obvious. They had expected to find either empty rooms or rough shelter, hastily arranged by a desperate hermit. Instead, they saw clear evidence of a life lived thoughtfully and peacefully, carved wooden furniture, well-maintained tools, and the unmistakable signs that human and bear had been sharing this space in harmony. Erik directed them to lay their injured friend on the sleeping platform, then immediately began gathering the supplies he would need. Months of learning domestic skills had taught him the basics of healing, and the previous owner's well-stocked medicine chest provided herbs and preparations for treating wounds. "What's your name, lad?" Erik asked the injured warrior as he examined the infected gash on his arm. "Bjorn," the young man replied through gritted teeth. "These are my shield brothers, Olaf and Magnus. We served under Jarl Eriksson before—" His voice trailed off as memory brought back images he clearly preferred not to relive. Erik nodded, understanding, as he cleaned the wound with water heated over the fire. Bear Friend had settled near the door, positioned where it could observe everything but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening. The bear's behavior was perfect, protective but not aggressive, alert but not hostile. Jarl Eriksson, Erik mused as he worked. "I knew him years ago. Good man, fought for the right reasons when he fought at all. What happened?" Magnus, the apparent leader of the group, spoke up. Land dispute with Jarl Thorvald should have been settled by negotiation, but Thorvald wanted a fight. Our Jarl tried to avoid it, but when Thorvald started burning farmsteads, he shrugged with the weary acceptance of men who had seen how quickly peace could turn to violence. Erik applied healing salve to Bjorn's wound, his hands steady despite the memories the story triggered. How many such conflicts had he participated in over the years? How many times had reasonable disputes been settled with blood because someone valued their reputation more than human lives? Thorvald's got 3 times our numbers, Olaf added, his young face showing the strain of recent trauma. Cut through our shield wall like it was grain stalks. We only got away because someone had to carry word to Jarl Eriksson's family. Tell them what happened. The familiar story of loyalty and loss struck Erik deeply. These young men were not fleeing from cowardice, but fulfilling the last duty their fallen lord could give them, ensuring that his death would not be meaningless, that someone would know how he had died and why. As Erik bandaged Bjorn's arm with clean cloth, he found himself remembering his own brother's death, his own desperate desire to find meaning in senseless violence. The difference was that these young warriors still had a chance to choose a different path before they became as lost as Erik had been. "You did your duty," Erik said quietly. "Now you need to decide what comes next." Bearfriend made a soft rumbling sound, and Erik looked up to see his companion approaching with careful steps. The bear moved to where the injured man could see it clearly, then settled down at a respectful distance. The gesture was unmistakably one of concern, as if the creature understood that someone was hurt and wanted to offer comfort. The 3 warriors stared in amazement. Bjorn, despite his fever and pain, managed a weak smile. "I've never seen anything like this. How is it possible?" Erik continued his ministrations while he spoke. "A wise man once told me that strength serves best when it protects rather than conquers. Your bear friend here understands that better than most humans ever do." As the afternoon wore on, Erik shared food with the strangers and listened to their story in more detail. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Young men following older ones into conflicts that served no one's true interests, fighting and dying for causes that would be forgotten before their bodies were cold. But Erik also saw something different in these 3. Unlike his own younger self, they seemed genuinely troubled by the violence they had witnessed. They spoke of their fallen Jarl with love rather than mere respect, and their concern for each other went deeper than simple military loyalty. When evening came and the fire cast dancing shadows on the Longhouse walls, Erik found himself at a crossroads. He could send these young warriors on their way with some food and basic medical care, maintaining the peaceful isolation he had worked so hard to achieve. Or he could offer them something more, a different vision of what strength could mean, a living example of the wisdom he had learned in this place. The decision would define not just his own future, but possibly theirs as well. And Erik understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with words, and the courage to show others a better way. As the fire burned lower and the 3 young warriors settled into the warmth of the Longhouse, Erik made his choice. He rose quietly and moved to where his shield hung on the wall, the same shield that had protected him through 30 years of warfare. Scarred and dented but still whole, but instead of taking it down as a weapon, Erik lifted it carefully and carried it to where the injured Bjorn lay resting. Without ceremony, he placed the shield beside the sleeping platform and began arranging bowls and utensils on its surface, transforming the implement of war into something that served life rather than death. "What are you doing?" Magnus asked, his voice soft with wonder. "Something I should have done years ago," Erik replied, continuing to arrange their shared meal on the shield's surface, making better use of tools that were designed for protecting people. Bearfriend approached to investigate this unusual development, its massive nose twitching as it examined the transformation. The bear's approval was evident in the way it settled nearby, clearly understanding that something significant was happening, even if it could not fully comprehend the symbolism. As they shared the meal, dried meat, preserved vegetables, and bread Erik had learned to bake in the Longhouse's simple oven, the conversation turned to questions Erik had not expected to face. "How long have you been here?" Olaf asked, gesturing to indicate not just the physical space, but the entire way of life they were witnessing. "Long enough to learn that everything I thought I knew about strength was wrong," Erik replied honestly. "I came here thinking I wanted to be left alone, to forget about the world and its troubles. Instead, I found someone who taught me what it really means to protect something you love." Bearfriend responded to the words with a soft rumble, moving closer until it could rest its massive head near Erik's shoulder. The gesture of affection was unmistakable, and Erik felt the familiar warmth of knowing he was valued, not for his usefulness in battle, but for who he had chosen to become. Magnus studied the interaction with the intensity of someone trying to understand a completely foreign concept. "You're not afraid of it at all?" "Afraid of Bearfriend? No more than I'd be afraid of any family member who happened to be large enough to break me in half, but chose not to," Erik said with gentle humor. "Fear comes from not understanding. Once you know someone well enough, you realize that the things that make them dangerous are often the same things that make them capable of great love." Bjorn, despite his injuries, had been following the conversation closely. "Family," he repeated thoughtfully. "That's what this is," Erik nodded. "Not the family either of us was born to, but the one we chose to build together. It's not about blood or duty or obligation. It's about deciding every day to care for each other's welfare." The three warriors exchanged glances, and Erik could see them processing concepts that challenged everything they had been taught about the natural order. In their world, humans dominated animals or were threatened by them. The idea of genuine partnership, of mutual respect and affection, was almost incomprehensible. Could others learn to do this? Magnus asked carefully, as if afraid the question might break some spell that made the impossible possible. Erik considered the question seriously. "Anyone who's willing to put aside what they think they know about power and control, yes. It requires patience, respect, and the understanding that true strength comes from building things up rather than tearing them down." He gestured toward the walls of the Longhouse, decorated with the previous owner's carvings and the tapestry that showed human and bear in harmony. "The man who lived here before me spent 15 years learning these lessons. He had a family, a wife, children, and they all shared this space with Bearfriend. It can be done, but only by people who understand that dominance is not the same as leadership." As the evening progressed, Erik found himself sharing more of his story than he had told anyone except Bearfriend. He spoke of his brother's death, of the gradual realization that his life of violence served no meaningful purpose, of the journey that had brought him to this place where healing was possible. The young warriors listened with the intensity of men who recognized their own potential futures in Erik's words. They were at the same crossroads he had once faced. They could continue down the path of violence until it destroyed them, or they could choose something different while they still had the chance. "What would you have us do?" Magnus asked finally. "We have duties, people depending on us to carry word of our Jarl's death." "Fulfill your duties," Erik said immediately. "Honor your fallen lord by completing the task he gave you. But after that, remember what you've seen here. Remember that there are other ways to live, other definitions of honor that don't require you to die young or carry the weight of endless killing." Erik stood and moved to his pack, withdrawing the leather journal he had been keeping. The pages were filled with his observations about living peacefully, about the lessons Bearfriend had taught him, about the slow process of healing from the wounds that violence left on the soul. "Take this with you," Erik said, offering the journal to Magnus. "Not to copy exactly, but to remember that change is possible. When you're ready to lay down your swords, you'll know how to begin building something better." Magnus accepted the journal with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred trust. "Why are you doing this for us? You don't know us, owe us nothing." Erik looked around the Longhouse, at the tapestry showing human and bear in harmony, at Bearfriend watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes, at his shield serving as a table instead of a weapon. Because someone needs to pass on what we learn here. The old man who lived before me left messages carved in the walls, wisdom that helped me understand what was possible. Now it's my turn to help others find their way to something better. Bearfriend rose and approached the three warriors, moving with the careful deliberation it used when interacting with nervous humans. One by one, it sniffed gently at each man, then settled back with what Erik recognized as acceptance. The bear had decided these strangers were worthy of trust, at least for now. You have Bearfriend's approval, Erik observed with a smile. That's worth more than any lord's blessing, I can tell you. As the night deepened and preparations were made for sleep, Erik felt a profound sense of completion. He had been tested by the arrival of these young warriors, forced to choose between the isolation he had originally sought and the responsibility of sharing what he had learned. By choosing to help, to offer a different path, he had honored not just his own transformation, but the memory of the family that had originally made this place a sanctuary of love and healing. Tomorrow, the three warriors would continue their journey, carrying both their sad news and their new understanding of what strength could mean. And Erik would remain with Bearfriend, tending their garden and their friendship, knowing that the wisdom they had discovered together would live on in others who needed to find their own way home. 3 days after the young warriors departed, carrying with them Erik's journal and a new understanding of what strength could mean, Erik stood at the edge of his garden and surveyed the work of his hands. The plants were thriving in the rich forest soil, tended with the same attention to detail he had once devoted to maintaining weapons of war. Bearfriend lay nearby in a patch of morning sunlight, watching Erik's work with the contented expression of a creature completely at peace with its place in the world. The massive bear had grown sleeker over the months they had shared together, its coat glossy with health, and its movements carrying the relaxed confidence of an animal that knew it was loved. Erik paused in his weeding to watch his companion, still marveling at the transformation their relationship represented. What had begun as a territorial standoff between two wounded souls had evolved into something that felt like the family he had never thought possible to have. Not the family of blood and obligation he had been born to, but the family of choice and mutual care that had proven more durable than any bond he had previously known. The morning's work completed, Erik returned to the Longhouse to attend to a project that had occupied his spare time for weeks. On his workbench lay a piece of oak he had been carving with infinite patience, shaping it into a sign that would stand beside the path leading to their home. The wood had required careful attention, each cut planned to work with the grain rather than against it. And the result was something that spoke of permanence and welcome in equal measure. The carving read simply, "Peace dwells here. All who come in friendship are welcome to share our fire." Below the words, Erik had carved images that told the story of the Longhouse, a human figure and a bear sitting together beside flames, surrounded by symbols representing the harmony that was possible between different kinds of beings who chose to understand rather than fear each other. Bearfriend approached to investigate the completed sign, sniffing carefully at the carved oak before making a sound that Erik had learned indicated approval. The bear's opinion mattered more to Erik than any jarl's praise had ever done, representing as it did the judgment of someone who had learned to love without condition or expectation of reward. Together, they carried the sign outside and positioned it where travelers would see it before reaching the Longhouse itself. Erik wanted anyone who found their way here to understand immediately what kind of place this was, what values governed the life that had been built within these walls. As Erik secured the sign to its post, he reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when he had opened the door expecting solitude and found partnership instead. The man who had paid 5 copper coins for simple shelter would hardly recognize the person he had become, someone who had learned to create rather than destroy, to nurture rather than conquer, to find strength in connection rather than isolation. The ring on his finger caught the morning light as he worked, and Erik thought of his father with gratitude rather than the bitter disappointment that had once colored such memories. The old man had tried to teach lessons about honor and responsibility that Erik had been too young and too eager for glory to understand. Now finally, he was living in a way that would have made his father proud, not because he had achieved fame or conquered enemies, but because he had learned what it meant to be worthy of love. Bear Friend had wandered over to investigate the garden, and Erik watched as his companion carefully avoided stepping on the growing plants. The bear's consideration for their shared project was just one example of the intelligence and emotional depth that continued to amaze Erik even after all these months of close companionship. Later that afternoon, as Erik worked on repairing winter damage to the Longhouse roof, he was surprised to see travelers approaching on the forest path. But instead of armed warriors or desperate refugees, these were a family, 2 adults and 3 children, moving with the unhurried pace of people who had found what they were seeking. Erik climbed down from the roof and walked out to greet them, Bear Friend falling into step beside him with the natural ease of long partnership. The family stopped when they saw the massive bear, but their expressions showed curiosity rather than fear, especially among the children. "Are you the man who helped Magnus and his friends?" the older woman asked, her voice carrying the cautious hope of someone who had heard stories that seemed too good to believe. "If Magnus told you that 3 weary warriors found healing and wisdom here, then yes," Erik replied, gesturing toward the Longhouse. "You're welcome to share our fire and our food, if that's what you're seeking." The youngest child, a girl perhaps 7 years old, stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of the very young. "Is that really a tame bear?" she asked, pointing at Bear Friend. Erik smiled, remembering another little girl who had once played with this same gentle giant. "Not tame, exactly. Free, but choosing to share his freedom with friends. Would you like to meet him properly?" What followed was a scene that would have been impossible for Erik to imagine just a year earlier. The children, with their parents' careful permission and Erik's gentle guidance, learned to approach Bear Friend with respect rather than fear. The massive creature responded with the patience of someone who had once been beloved by other children, allowing small hands to touch his fur and responding to their excited chatter with soft rumbles of acknowledgement. As evening fell and the family shared their meal around the fire, Erik found himself telling the story of the Longhouse and its history, of the love that had been built within these walls, and the tragedy that had nearly ended it. He spoke of lessons learned and wisdom gained, of the choice to build rather than destroy that was available to anyone willing to make it. The children listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed they understood this was more than just an entertaining story. This was a different way of seeing the world, a vision of what was possible when beings chose understanding over conquest, when strength served love rather than pride. When the family finally settled for sleep, the Longhouse filled with the peaceful sounds of people who felt safe and welcome. Erik reflected on how completely his life had changed direction. He had come here seeking an end to his story, a quiet place to wait for death. Instead, he had found a new beginning, a way of living that honored both his past experience and his capacity for growth. Bear Friend settled beside him as he had every night for months now. The familiar weight and warmth of his companion, a reminder that love could take many forms and still be genuine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the lessons they had learned together, new chances to show others what was possible when strength served love instead of pride. As sleep claimed him, Erik's last conscious thought was one of gratitude, not just for the peace he had found, but for the privilege of sharing it with someone who understood its value as deeply as he did. The 5 copper coins he had paid for this place had bought him far more than shelter from the storm. They had bought him a chance to become the man he was always meant to be, surrounded by the family he had chosen and had chosen him in return. Outside, the forest whispered its ancient songs of growth and renewal, while inside the Longhouse, Two unlikely companions rested secure in the knowledge that they had found something worth protecting, not just their physical sanctuary, but the love that made it truly home. The warrior's long journey was finally complete, not in death as he had once expected, but in the discovery that the greatest victories were won not with weapons, but with the courage to open one's heart to connection and trust. In the morning, the sign Erik had carved would greet new travelers with its promise of peace and welcome, carrying forward the wisdom learned in this place, where a man and a bear had discovered that the strongest bonds are forged not in the heat of battle, but in the patient daily choice to care for each other's well-being. And somewhere in the wider world, young warriors who had once known only the language of violence were learning to speak the words of healing, carrying the Longhouse's gift of transformation to others who desperately needed to believe that change was possible. The story that had begun with 5 coins and a desperate search for solitude had become something far greater, a testament to the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds, and proof that it is never too late to choose a different path, as long as we have the courage to believe we are worthy of redemption.